Along the stretch of West Dickens Avenue in the heart of Chicago, there rises a water tower that has stood through decades of change, seasons, and shifting fortunes. The paint across its surface has softened with age, and the lettering once bold and sharp has gradually blurred into a quiet whisper against the metal. Yet even now, for those patient enough to look closely, the name remains readable: Zenith, still pressing through the rust and the weathering like a signature that refuses to be completely forgotten. Beneath that tower, the building it once faithfully served has undergone the kind of transformation that time brings to places no longer in use. Sections of the structure have given way. Windows stand open to the sky, some stripped of their glass long ago, others carrying the colorful marks left by those who turned these walls into a canvas. Green, stubborn vegetation has found its way through the cracks in the concrete, threading upward through the floors as though nature itself has decided to reclaim the space. In the year 2017, emergency crews responded to a fire that swept through what remained of the interior, leaving behind scorched walls and memories pressed into ash. The structure today stands as a place best admired from a respectful distance, and the people who live nearby have wisely guided their children away from it and toward safer ground. Yet for all of what this place looks like today, it was once alive with the energy of more than 2,500 working men and women, all gathered under one roof in the year 1922, building radios and televisions and high-fidelity stereo systems that made their way into the living rooms of families stretched across every corner of America. The company that employed them had a saying that became as familiar as a handshake in those years: the quality goes in before the name goes on. It was a promise, and for a very long time millions of Americans held that promise close and believed in it completely. Today this place stands as something more than a location on a city map. It stands as a reminder of something that once filled an entire chapter of American life. Not simply a corporation but a living, breathing industrial culture where innovation, craftsmanship, and community all shared the same address. The question worth exploring here is not simply about one company's journey. It is the much larger story of what it meant when an American manufacturing institution that employed 11,000 people across 7 separate facilities, that gave the world the wireless remote control, and that engineered the very transmission technology powering every high-definition broadcast across the United States, eventually passed its final chapter. The physical spaces where American industry wrote its greatest stories are worth visiting and worth remembering. There are still things to be seen here, things worth documenting before the last traces disappear entirely. So let us begin. To understand how this story truly starts, we need to travel back to 1918, a moment in time that feels almost impossible to connect to the ruins standing today. Chicago at the close of the First World War was a city running on ambition. A place where the smell of the stockyards mixed with the heat rising off the steel mills, where waves of immigrant workers arrived every season and poured their energy into buildings and machines and factories that seemed to grow taller and wider with every passing year. Fortunes were built inside a single generation, and the city hummed with the belief that hard work and clever thinking could move any man from nothing to something remarkable. It was inside this atmosphere that 2 young men named Carl Hassel and Ralph Matthews were quietly building something of their own. Working from a modest apartment, they had set up an amateur radio station and were hand-assembling radio equipment for fellow enthusiasts who shared their passion for the emerging technology of wireless communication. Their station carried the call letters 9ZN, and from those letters they shaped a name, first stretching it into Zeppinith, then trimming it down into something cleaner and more memorable: Zenith. The 2 men had genuine technical skill flowing through them, but the financial resources and the business experience that would be needed to grow their idea into something significant were still beyond their reach. What they did possess, however, was access to a license granted by the brilliant inventor Edwin Armstrong, whose collection of patents held enormous influence over much of the radio technology landscape of the era. That license, and the doors it could open, soon caught the eye of a man whose vision and drive would transform what Hassel and Matthews had started into something far greater than either of them had imagined on their own. His name was Eugene Francis McDonald, Jr., and when he first heard about the little radio station and its Armstrong license, he was 35 years old and earning his living selling automobiles. Born in Syracuse in the year 1886, McDonald had grown up in a household where his father operated a modest store that provided for the family in the simplest terms. By the age of 14, young Eugene had already stepped away from school and walked through the doors of a factory to begin earning. By 1904, he had made his way to Chicago, where he quickly discovered within himself a remarkable gift for capturing public attention. He was the kind of man who understood that a well-timed gesture could be worth more than a full page of advertising copy. On one memorable occasion, he arranged to drive an automobile directly up the steps of the General John Logan Memorial, with a photographer ready to capture the moment and a policeman standing close enough to make the scene feel genuinely dramatic. He quietly paid that officer $10 for his participation, and the resulting photograph traveled from one newspaper to the next across the city, spreading McDonald's name on the wind. When the United States entered the war in 1917, McDonald stepped into naval intelligence, bringing with him a working understanding of a telegraph phone device used to record conversations, knowledge made more valuable by the fact that the company that originally manufactured the device had since closed its doors. That expertise secured him a commission, and he climbed steadily through the ranks until he held the title of lieutenant commander. For the remainder of his life, he preferred to be addressed simply as commander, and the people around him honored that preference without question. In 1921, McDonald first learned about Hassel and Matthews, and he recognized immediately what their Armstrong license represented. He committed his personal savings to the venture, and 2 years later, in 1923, they formalized their partnership by incorporating under the name Zenith Radio Corporation. McDonald received the largest share of the company's stock. He was 37 years old and standing at the beginning of something that would define the rest of his life. That same year, the founding group welcomed a new partner named Hugh Robertson, who brought to the company an approach to financial management that would quietly become one of Zenith's most important long-term strengths. Where McDonald supplied the imagination and the flair for storytelling, Robertson supplied the discipline and the careful stewardship of resources that would keep the company standing when others around it began to stumble. Together, the two men formed a partnership that would guide Zenith through tests that no one could fully anticipate. McDonald understood from the very beginning that in a market crowded with competing voices, technical excellence alone would not be enough. Zenith needed to become a name that people recognized, admired, and trusted. His method was to turn himself into the story that the company needed told. He stepped into the role of adventurer, explorer, and living embodiment of the spirit he wanted associated with Zenith's products. In 1923, he persuaded the esteemed Arctic explorer Admiral Donald Macmillan to carry a Zenith shortwave radio on an expedition into the frozen north. The transmissions that Macmillan sent back from those distant, icy landscapes gave Americans their first vivid demonstration of what shortwave communication could accomplish across impossible distances. Zenith's advertising made absolutely certain that every reader of every newspaper understood which company had made that communication possible. In 1925, McDonald joined a second Macmillan expedition, this time serving as ship commander, traveling as far as Greenland, where he held his microphone toward a group of Inuit singers and broadcast their voices across the airwaves to listeners sitting in their homes across America. Those broadcasts became something people talked about for weeks, and once again, Zenith's advertising connected that sense of wonder directly to its products, positioning the company as the natural choice of those who reached for the horizon. But the marketing succeeded precisely because the engineering behind it was genuine. In 1924, Zenith gave the world its first portable radio. In 1926, the company introduced the first home receiver powered by household electrical current rather than batteries, ending the frustration of constantly replacing power sources. In 1927, Zenith added push-button tuning to its radios, freeing listeners from the careful and often tedious process of manually adjusting dials to find a signal. That same year, the company settled on the slogan that would follow it for decades: "The quality goes in before the name goes on," and by 1927, Zenith had also grown large enough to secure its own manufacturing license directly from RCA, a milestone that reflected just how far the company had traveled in a few short years. The employees who worked inside Zenith's walls could sense that they were part of something different from the ordinary factory experience, and they responded to McDonald's demanding leadership with loyalty, in part because the company's profit-sharing arrangements placed Zenith among the most generous employers in all of American industry. Workers shared in the success they helped create, and that connection ran deep. The radio boom that swept through the 1920s pulled dozens of new companies into the market, each one competing for a share of American living rooms and wallets. McDonald steered Zenith through that crowded field with a clarity of purpose that most of his rivals lacked. In a time when manufacturers were busy competing on technical specifications that most ordinary consumers had no reliable way to evaluate, McDonald had given his company something more powerful than a specification sheet. He had given it a personality. Zenith was not simply selling a radio. It was selling the feeling of reaching out across thousands of miles and hearing a voice from a place you might never visit. It was selling exploration, curiosity, and the quiet thrill of knowing that the world was reachable from your own chair by your own window. The Arctic expeditions were more than publicity exercises. They were proof that Zenith's technology could perform at the farthest edges of the known world. And yet McDonald never allowed the storytelling to drift away from the substance underneath it. He held his engineers to standards of excellence that treated every consumer frustration as a problem worth solving, and he made certain the profit-sharing culture created a workforce that cared about the outcome of their work. When the financial markets collapsed in October of 1929 and the country began its long and difficult walk through the Great Depression, the radio industry absorbed the shock in ways that separated the genuinely well-managed companies from those that had been built on easier foundations. Dozens of manufacturers that had flourished during the boom years of the 20s found themselves unable to continue. Zenith's own revenues dropped sharply, falling from $10 million in 1929 to under $2 million by 1932, and the company recorded 5 consecutive years of financial losses. But Zenith kept going. Hugh Robertson's financial discipline had ensured that when the crash arrived, the company was not carrying the heavy debt loads that were pulling others under. Zenith could absorb the pressure in ways its competitors could not. McDonald's workforce, shaped by years of profit sharing and genuine investment in the company's culture, responded to the difficult period with a willingness to accept reduced pay and extended hours in order to keep the enterprise alive. The loyalty that had been built during better times now returned its value in full. And McDonald never stopped thinking. In 1934 he sent a telegram to every oil and tire company operating in America, drawing their attention to the empty streets during a presidential radio address, using that observation as an opening to invite them to become Zenith Auto radio dealers. One of his ideas during the Depression years was the introduction of a large black dial for radio sets, featuring oversized clock-style numbers designed to be easily read from across a room or by anyone who needed a stronger visual reference. By 1936, Zenith was recording profits again. By 1941, the company had climbed to second place in an American radio industry then valued at $600 million, standing directly behind RCA. The operation that had launched from a kitchen table now employed thousands of workers and shipped products to customers around the world. When Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the Second World War, Zenith's engineers redirected the same expertise they had spent years developing for consumer radios and applied it to radar systems and military communications equipment. The war years brought a remarkable expansion to Zenith's manufacturing capabilities. The company grew its facilities, trained thousands of new workers, among them large numbers of women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, and refined its mastery of mass production techniques. By 1943, nearly every unit of the company's production capacity had been redirected toward fulfilling military contracts. Yet even through all of this, McDonald held the post-war future firmly in his thinking. Even while his factories were running on wartime schedules, Zenith continued to maintain its advertising presence with civilian audiences, keeping the brand clear and familiar in people's minds for the day when they would be buying again. McDonald's personal commitment to quality extended across everything Zenith made, but no pursuit consumed him more intensely than his long campaign to produce the perfect portable radio. He was an experienced yachtsman, and his vessel, the Mispa, one of the largest privately owned yachts sailing the Great Lakes, provided him with first-hand experience of the limitations of standard AM broadcasts, which faded into static when the ship moved beyond a few hundred miles from shore. What McDonald wanted was a portable radio capable of receiving not only standard broadcast frequencies but shortwave signals as well, the high-frequency transmissions that travel by bouncing off the ionosphere and can carry a voice from one side of the Earth to the other. The engineering obstacles standing between that vision and a working product were substantial. Vacuum tubes struggled to operate reliably at higher frequencies on the lower voltages that battery-powered designs required. McDonald rejected prototype after prototype, personally evaluating each one during his voyages on the Great Lakes. Late in 1941, his engineering team finally delivered what he had been searching for, a device they designated the Model 7G605, which McDonald named the Clipper. It was the world's first fully portable multi-band radio, designed to receive both standard and shortwave broadcasts. Production was just getting underway in 1942 when America's entry into the war brought consumer manufacturing to a halt. After the war ended, Zenith resumed production of the radio under a new name, the Transoceanic, and the device went on to become something close to a legend among radio enthusiasts, world travelers, and everyone who understood quality when they held it in their hands. It remained in production until 1981, a run of 39 years. Many collectors today consider it the finest mass-produced portable radio ever built. In December of 1957, McDonald and his team reached another milestone with the introduction of the Royal 1000, the world's first portable transistorized multi-band radio. The commander, now 71 years old, oversaw the project personally. It would stand as his final major contribution to Zenith's product development. Even as his engineers were mastering radio, McDonald had been carefully watching the rise of television. Zenith had been exploring television technology since 1939, but McDonald carried a genuine skepticism about the commercial television model that was emerging. He believed that viewers would eventually grow weary of commercial interruptions and had long been convinced that the business of advertising-supported television carried within it the seeds of its own contradiction. His proposed solution was a subscription model. Zenith launched an experimental system called Phone Vision, which required viewers to connect a descrambler box to their telephone lines. When a viewer wanted to watch a premium program, they would call a Zenith operator, who would send a signal to unlock the video content. The system was ahead of its time by several decades, and within it one can see the direct ancestor of HBO, cable television, and every streaming platform that audiences rely on today. Despite his reservations about commercial television, McDonald understood that Zenith could not afford to stand apart from the market. The company placed its first television sets in front of American consumers in 1948, and it was in the television business that McDonald's commitment to quality would produce both Zenith's most celebrated engineering achievements and a set of choices whose long-term consequences would eventually become clear. In the early 1950s, manufacturers including RCA and General Electric began transitioning from hand-wired chassis to printed circuit boards, a shift that reduced assembly time and the opportunity for human error. However, circuit boards carried a vulnerability with vacuum tube equipment. The high temperatures generated by the tubes could, over time, cause the boards to break down. Zenith, following McDonald's direction, stayed with hand-wired chassis and all its vacuum tube equipment. Every connection was made by skilled workers who soldered each wire by hand, one at a time. The process was slower. It cost more. And it produced the most dependable television sets available anywhere in America. Alongside that commitment to reliability, Zenith's engineers were quietly rewriting the rules of the television experience itself. In 1950, the company introduced the Lazy Bones, the first television remote control ever offered to consumers. It connected to the television set by a cable running to the viewer's chair, and while customers appreciated the convenience it brought, many were frustrated by the wire stretched across their living room floors. McDonald directed his engineers to develop a version that required no wire at all. Early attempts using radio wave signals proved inconsistent because of interference from other radio sources in the environment. In 1955, an engineer named Eugene Pauly introduced a device called the Flashmatic, which used a directional beam of light aimed at photosensitive receivers positioned in the corners of the television cabinet. But bright sunlight could accidentally trigger the controls, and a better solution was still needed. In 1956, engineer Robert Adler proposed using ultrasonic sound waves, frequencies too high for human ears to detect, as the signal carrier. The handheld remote he developed contained small aluminum rods that produced distinct high-pitched tones when struck, and the television's built-in receiver detected those tones and translated them into commands. Zenith released this innovation as the Space Command, priced at $259.95, an amount equivalent to roughly $2,800 by today's standards. It was positioned as a premium product, and it performed exactly as promised. Space Command remotes built in the 1950s are still functioning perfectly today, more than 6 decades after they were manufactured. Over the 25 years that Adler's ultrasonic technology remained the industry standard, more than 9 million ultrasonic remote control televisions were sold to American households. In 1997, both Adler and Pauly were honored with Emmy Awards from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences for their pioneering contributions to the technology. Both men had devoted their entire professional careers to Zenith. On May 15, 1958, Commander Eugene F. McDonald Jr. passed away in Chicago at the age of 72. He had guided Zenith from its first days as a kitchen table operation into a position alongside RCA as one of the 2 largest television manufacturers in the country. His passing left the company without the singular vision and driving force that had shaped every important decision it had made. He was laid to rest in the McDonald family crypt at Queen of Heaven Catholic Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, just a short distance from the factories where thousands of workers were still assembling the radios and televisions that carried the name he had spent a lifetime making meaningful. By 1960, Zenith and RCA each commanded more than 20% of the American television market, with 25 other manufacturers dividing the remainder between them. The 1962 Illinois Manufacturers Directory offered a picture of Zenith at the full height of its reach. The company employed 11,000 workers across 7 plants in the Chicago area. The main facility at 601 West Dickens Avenue housed 2,500 employees building radio sets, television sets and high-fidelity stereo equipment. A second facility at 1500 North Carlo Avenue employed 2,100 workers producing government electronics, radio and television components, transistors and hearing aids. The company had extended itself further through subsidiaries including the Rowland Corporation at 4245 North Knox Avenue, where 850 workers produced television picture tubes. In 1966, Rowland acquired the former Keebler Cookie facility in Melrose Park and converted it into a color cathode ray tube production center, a plant that would eventually carry the distinction of being the last Zenith manufacturing facility to operate on American soil. Throughout the 1960s, Zenith's engineering teams continued extending the frontiers of what television technology could do. In 1954, they had already introduced the industry's first 21-inch 3-electron gun rectangular color picture tube. In 1969, they unveiled the Chromacolor Black Matrix picture tube, a genuine leap forward that doubled image brightness and set a new performance standard that the entire industry worked to match. Even as Zenith embraced the solid-state era, the company maintained the engineering philosophy that McDonald had established. Circuit boards did not appear inside Zenith televisions until the Chromacolor product line of the early 1970s, and even then only in combination with solid-state components. The quality that Zenith advertised was real and measurable. Service technicians working across the country consistently found that a Zenith television required less attention and lasted longer than the products of competing brands. The company's commitment extended beyond its products to the men and women who built them. Zenith employees often spent their entire working lives within the company, moving between plants and departments as they accumulated experience and advanced in seniority. Fathers and sons worked side by side on the same production lines. Whole families organized their daily rhythms around the schedule of Zenith's shift changes. The plants were more than buildings where work was performed. They were communities with their own social fabric, where workers shared meals in company cafeterias, gathered at company-organized events, and celebrated the milestones of their colleagues who had long since become genuine friends. In the early 1970s, a new kind of challenge began arriving at American ports. Container ships were unloading television sets manufactured by Japanese companies, Sony, Matsushita, Toshiba, Hitachi, Sharp, Sanyo, companies that had rebuilt their industrial base after the Second World War using modern facilities and operating with different cost structures. These televisions were reaching American store shelves at prices that created a difficult arithmetic for American manufacturers to solve. American workers earned American wages. American factories paid American utility rates, property taxes, and regulatory compliance costs. By 1970, the competitive pressure was becoming very real. In December of that year, National Union Electric, the corporate successor to Emerson Radio, filed suit against the major Japanese television manufacturers, alleging that they had violated the Anti-Dumping Act of 1916 and had conspired to capture the American consumer electronics market through pricing strategies that could not be explained by ordinary business rationale. Zenith watched the development of that case while its own market position faced ongoing pressure from overseas competition. By 1974, the company joined the lawsuit alongside NUE, Sears Roebuck and Motorola, with the combined case seeking $900 million in damages. The legal proceeding that followed became one of the most complex antitrust cases in American history. Zenith's chairman, John Nevin, appeared before Congress and publicly raised the issue of pricing practices in the Japanese television market. But the courts ultimately viewed the arguments differently. In 1981, the trial court ruled in favor of the defendants. The plaintiffs appealed, and in March of 1986, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its ruling on the antitrust claims, finding in favor of the Japanese manufacturers. The court's reasoning turned on the economics of the alleged arrangement, questioning why rational companies would sustain extended periods of reduced returns on the hope of eventually controlling a market whose outcome remained uncertain. The conclusion of the legal proceedings was a significant turning point for Zenith's leadership. They had placed their trust in the American legal process to address what they believed was an unfair competitive environment. When the Supreme Court reached its decision, it closed a door that Zenith's management had been counting on. The landscape of American consumer electronics had been changing steadily. In 1974, Motorola sold its Quasar television division to Matsushita Electric Industrial, with the company's representatives explaining that their strategic future lay in semiconductors and two-way radio. RCA, which had long been Zenith's great rival in the television market, shifted its research energy towards speculative projects and gradually surrendered its edge in color television. General Electric eventually acquired RCA in 1986, and the consumer electronics portion of the RCA business was subsequently sold to Thomson of France. Admiral, Philco, Dumont, Magnavox. The storied names of American television manufacturing stepped back one by one, some disappearing entirely, others finding new ownership under foreign parent companies. Zenith's chairman, John Nevin, recognized what was happening around him and understood that the company could not continue on domestic production alone. In 1977, Zenith established its first production facilities outside the United States, opening operations in Matamoros, Mexico, and in Taiwan. By 1978, the company had reduced its American workforce by 25%, and the profit-sharing programs that had been one of the pillars of Zenith's relationship with its employees were phased out in the period that followed. In 1977, Zenith also reduced the size of its research and development staff, releasing approximately 200 engineers. It was a decision driven by near-term financial realities, and its effects were felt for years afterward, as the institutional knowledge those engineers carried with them left the building along with the people themselves. That same year, Zenith reached an arrangement with Japan's Sony Corporation to market Sony's Betamax home video recorder in the United States under the Zenith label. The company that had built its identity on American engineering innovation was now placing a Japanese-made product in front of American consumers under its own name. The reductions in American staffing continued through the late 1970s, and the Chicago neighborhoods where Zenith workers had long made their homes began to feel those changes in ways that were quiet but accumulating. A smaller lunch crowd at neighborhood restaurants, homes on the market a little longer, families recalculating their plans for the future. By the early 1980s, Zenith stood as the sole remaining American television manufacturer still competing under American ownership. Every significant competitor had either folded, been acquired by a foreign company, or made the decision to exit the consumer electronics business. In 1982, Zenith recorded a net loss of $24 million and for the first time in nearly 50 years, did not pay a dividend to shareholders. The unbroken line of payments that had endured through the Depression, through the Second World War, and through every challenge the company had faced in between was finally interrupted. That same year, Zenith produced its last radio, quietly bringing to a close the business that had given the company its very identity, the business that Carl Hassel and Ralph Matthews had begun from their apartment, the business that had produced the legendary Transoceanic. In 1984, the company removed the word radio from its corporate name, becoming Zenith Electronics Corporation. The word that connected the present-day company to its origins was officially retired. Yet there were meaningful developments on other fronts that carried real promise. Jerry Pullman, a senior Zenith finance executive who would eventually become chairman, had been guiding the company into the personal computer market since 1979. Zenith acquired the Heath Company for $64.5 million, a well-timed purchase that came just as Heath had announced its first personal computer kit. The wholly owned subsidiary that grew from that acquisition, known as Zenith Data Systems, became one of the most successful computer manufacturers of the 1980s. The first Zenith computer, the Z100, was introduced in 1981, and 35,000 units shipped in its first year alone. By the end of the decade, Zenith Data Systems had grown into a billion-dollar operation. The success of the computer division created an internal conversation about the company's direction, with computer-focused leaders pointing toward the shifting landscape of the technology industry and television leaders making the case that their market was still essential. The debate absorbed management energy that might otherwise have been directed at competitive challenges in both areas. As the decade moved toward its close, a new technological frontier opened that offered Zenith a genuinely transformative opportunity: high-definition television. HDTV promised image resolution far beyond anything standard analog broadcasts could deliver, and the United States government, aware of how much ground American manufacturers had already yielded in consumer electronics, actively encouraged domestic companies to develop systems that could shape the next generation of the medium. Zenith committed itself to the effort with the focused energy of a company that understood the stakes involved. In 1989, the company formed a partnership with AT&T to develop a digital HDTV transmission system. AT&T Bell Laboratories would contribute video compression technology, AT&T Microelectronics would develop the required semiconductors, and Zenith would bring its deep expertise in transmission systems to the collaboration. The results of that partnership were extraordinary by any technical measure. Zenith's engineers developed a transmission method called VSB, vestigial sideband, capable of delivering high-definition television signals in a way that minimized interference with existing analog broadcasts. In early 1994, the Grand Alliance, the industry consortium responsible for establishing the American HDTV standard, selected Zenith's VSB technology as the terrestrial broadcast and cable transmission system. In December of 1996, the Federal Communications Commission formally adopted Zenith's digital transmission technology as the foundation of the ATSC digital television broadcast standard. Every high-definition broadcast in America would henceforth travel through the air using technology that Zenith had created. In 1997, Zenith and the other members of the Grand Alliance were honored with a technical Emmy for their pioneering achievements. It was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement in American engineering. A company that had faced the most intense competitive pressure the industry could produce had nonetheless managed to invent the technology that would define television for generations to come. There was, however, a timing challenge that no engineering victory could fully resolve. The HDTV standard that Zenith had helped create existed in test broadcasts and research facilities, but commercial products remained years away from mass-market availability. The years of development had consumed resources, and the company needed financial results in the present tense. To fund its HDTV research and address its debt position, Zenith made the decision in October 1989 to sell Zenith Data Systems to the Paris-based Group Bull for $511 million, a figure that was later increased to $635 million. The division that had been consistently generating profit for the company was sold. In 1990, recognizing that it needed a stable partnership structure, Zenith sold a 5% ownership stake to the Korean company Gold Star, which would later rename itself LG Electronics, as part of a technology sharing arrangement. On October 29, 1991, Zenith announced that its television assembly operations in Springfield, Missouri, would be transferred to Mexico. The Springfield facility had employed 1,500 people, men and women who had built their professional lives and daily routines around the rhythms of that plant. Workers gathered in small groups around the facility to absorb the news together, some finding it difficult to express, others sitting quietly with the weight of it. The plant had been the steady economic foundation for the surrounding working-class neighborhoods, and its transition meant something felt deeply by the entire community. In late 1996, Zenith announced a further reduction of approximately 25% of its remaining American workforce, affecting roughly 1,175 workers. The company also postponed plans for a $100 million large-screen picture tube facility in Woodridge, Illinois, that had been intended to position Zenith competitively for the HDTV era. On July 17, 1995, Zenith's board of directors approved a transaction that represented the culmination of a long transformation in American television manufacturing. LG Electronics would acquire an additional ownership stake for $351 million, raising its total ownership to approximately 58% and establishing controlling interest. The news was reported with a directness that captured the historical significance of the moment. A Korean company was purchasing Zenith, the last American television manufacturer. After nearly 80 years, the American television industry had passed out of American hands. For those who had been following the story closely, it was a moment that required some time to absorb fully. What makes this story different from others like it is what comes after. Today, the Zenith Research and Development Laboratory continues operating in Lincolnshire, Illinois, developing transmission technologies for its parent company, LG Electronics. The lab contributed meaningfully to the development of ATSC 3.0, the next-generation broadcast standard that is currently being deployed across the United States. In this focused and technical sense, Zenith's legacy of innovation continues. The factories, however, are gone. The workforce that filled them has long since moved on or passed from the scene entirely. What McDonald built has been distilled down to a team of engineers and a portfolio of patents. If you make the drive to Belmont Cragen today and find your way to the old Dickens Avenue complex, the water tower is still there, still rising above the surrounding rooflines. The walls of the plant below it carry marks from the 2017 fire, and photographers who document urban landscapes visit regularly to record what remains. In the comment sections of the posts they share online, the responses fill with remembrances. Someone who worked there from 1954 to 1998 recalling the experience in 2 words: many memories. Someone whose grandmother had assembled radar equipment inside that building during the Second World War. Someone who began working for Zenith in 1961 and was trained as an industrial engineer at Plant No. 3. Down the road from the Dickens Avenue site, the building that housed Plant No. 2 found a different kind of second chapter. Renovated during the 2000s and the 2010s, it was converted into commercial kitchen and food production facilities. The structure that once built televisions now produces meals. It is a different purpose entirely, but the building endures and workers still clock in and out of its doors each day. The Melrose Park facility followed a different path. The structure was eventually demolished, and the land it occupied sits open, its future still undetermined. Commander Eugene F. McDonald Jr. rests in the family crypt at Queen of Heaven Catholic Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. He has been gone for nearly 70 years. The company he built from nothing continued for 40 years beyond his passing before becoming part of a larger global enterprise. What he would make of the full arc of Zenith's story, no living person can say with certainty. History does not give us that kind of access. What we do know is this: a company was built. It employed thousands of people across decades and across generations. It made products that Americans trusted and relied on and kept in their homes until they wore out. It gave the world the wireless remote control. It gave America the transmission technology that makes high-definition broadcasting possible. And then the company in its original form passed from the scene. The factories became ruins or were repurposed or were taken down altogether. The workers who filled them built the rest of their lives in new directions. The products they made now sit on shelves in antique shops and in collectors' spaces, carrying the quiet dignity of objects that once served real purposes in real homes. But somewhere in America tonight, someone will reach for their television remote, that device that Zenith's engineers invented, refined, and perfected over years of patient work, and press a button. The signal will travel through technology that Zenith developed. A high-definition image will appear on the screen. And the person sitting in that chair will have no reason to think about any of this, no reason to trace the history living invisibly in the action they just took without a second thought. In 2008, Chicago Public Radio produced a documentary marking the 10th anniversary of the Melrose Park plant's closure, and the reporter Ben Calhoun spoke with former workers about what their time at Zenith had meant to them. One of those workers, asked to put words to what the final closing had felt like, paused and then said simply, "It was a big-time hurt." The remote controls that Zenith invented are in every hand. The transmission technology that Zenith developed carries every broadcast. The innovations that Zenith's engineers brought into the world live on, woven invisibly into the infrastructure of how millions of people live their everyday lives. The company is gone in the form it once held. The legacy it created remains entirely intact. Standing at the edge of the Dickens Avenue complex as the light of the day begins to soften and the water tower sends its long shadow across the ground below, you can still make out the letters if you take your time and look carefully. Zenith. The quality goes in before the name goes on. The name has faded. The stories have not. And perhaps that is what draws people to places like this. Not to find easy answers or final conclusions, but to stand in the presence of what remains, to witness the physical evidence of what was built and what was passed on, and to carry a little of that understanding forward into the world where the rest of us are still living.